first presentation defined ethics and morality. In this presentation, I want to introduce you to the approach we will be taking in this class. It is, for the most part, what is called a case approach. That is to say, we will focus typically on particular situations or cases related to controversial contemporary moral issues that arise in healthcare. We will analyze and structure our analysis of these situations and the controversies to which they are related using 5 basic moral principles. Here are the 5 moral principles: non-maleficence, beneficence, autonomy, justice, and fidelity. In the lectures that follow, I will be defining and speaking of some of the implications of each of those moral principles. Let me say a little something about what a moral principle is. A moral principle is an action guiding statement, but it's a general statement about how people ought to act individually and collectively or institutionally. A rule or a moral rule is a bit more specific about how people ought to act, and I think that our moral rules can be understood as being derived from or as specifications of a moral principle. So, for example, we have a rule against lying. I think the best way to make sense of that rule is to see it as a specification of the principle of autonomy. But we'll have a great deal more to say about that later. Pay close attention to something Post and Bluestein say in their first chapter after they have discussed the principles. They say that the principles, quote, are used in an attempt to render our moral convictions and the reasons for them coherent. Because these principles have validity and can be useful in thinking through ethical issues, they are referred to frequently in the following chapters, and we will be referring to them frequently throughout this course. But notice this cautionary note. However, it's important to resist the temptation to employ principles in a mechanical fashion. If used with judgment and sensitivity, they can provide structure and inform sound ethical reasoning. Used rigidly, without reference to context and narrative, however, principlist ethics can lead to a distorted and unhelpful analysis. Let me say a few things about their very wise comment here. First, notice they say that the principles are used to render our moral convictions and the reasons for them coherent. Sometimes we will say we have this obligation because it's consistent with the duty of beneficence. But the principle of beneficence doesn't give us those duties. Rather, we recognize those duties, we recognize those obligations, and we find the principle of beneficence helpful in our making sense of them, or making sense of those convictions. They help us render our moral convictions coherent. Also, notice their claim that the principles shouldn't be used in a mechanical fashion. Look, we're going to look at a whole lot of cases and we're going to try to say, well, one principle points in this direction, these two point in the other. Just because we have more principles on one side of a dilemma than the other, that doesn't mean that the moral balance tips in that direction. No, that would be to use the principles mechanically. This is not a mathematical equation, or these aren't mathematical equations we'll be creating with these principles. Rather, we'll just be using the principles to help us discern more deeply what our moral obligations are in situations like this. Finally, notice their comment about the need for context and narrative. Most of the cases we look at for classroom purposes are fairly brief. Sometimes you'll be frustrated that they don't have enough detail. In real life, a valid application of these principles can never be done apart from deep awareness of and sensitivity to the narrative, the story that each person brings to the situation which we're describing in a textbook in a very few words. But those warnings from Post and Bluestein about the use of principles are important, I think.